Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Ask the Council webinar, Strengthening Community Philanthropy Ad Hoc Working Group Recommendations. Before we get started, here are a few call reminders. For any technical issues, please submit a message or question through the Zoom Q&A function at the bottom of your screen or email us at webinars@cof.org. For closed captioning, please click on the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen and select Show Subtitle or View Full Transcript. This webinar will be recorded and the recording will be shared with all participants and posted on our website. And finally, if you have any questions, please submit them through the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. The questions will be monitored throughout the webinar and answered during the Q&A section. And with that, I'll hand it over to my colleague, David Kass, Vice President of Government Affairs at the Council on Foundations. Thank you all for joining us.
Thanks so much, Daniela. So I'm David Kass, the Vice President of Government Affairs of the Council. So I just want to thanks everybody for taking time in your busy calendars for this webinar. Our sector's been talking about donor advised funds for a long time. And at the Council, we have members with a lot of different perspectives on how to effectively and transparently use DAFs. We know they're an important tool in the philanthropic toolbox. And the flexibility of DAFs mean they can be used to address both emerging and long-term challenges that are facing people and nonprofits and communities. But we also recognize that there's some concerns about DAFs that are driven at times by misperceptions and other cases by valid criticisms. And so with that in mind, the Council convened a group of community foundations, CEOs, to develop principles and policy recommendations that would strengthen community philanthropy's use of DAFs. So this working group met over the course of 6 months. We had tons of meetings to develop a set of principles and policy recommendations to build trust in philanthropy without unintentionally slowing down charitable giving or unduly burdening philanthropic organizations. So on behalf of the Council, I just want to thank each of the working group members. In a few moments, you're going to hear from 3 of them. Before releasing these, we shared the recommendations with a limited group of people. Jeff Hammond, thanks to him, other community foundation CEOs and staff, with private foundation leaders and staff, with some of our philanthropy serving organization partners and others. And overall, we heard a lot of positive feedback about the recommendations. Many had great questions and suggestions for how to improve them. And we know that we want more sector engagement. When we released them yesterday, Kathleen Enright, our, of course, CEO, wrote in her email that we hope to work with you further to develop the recommendations because we want to continue to explore how do we increase transparency and trust and efficiency of charitable giving through DAFs. So today is just one of many opportunities to ask questions and to provide feedback. So over the coming weeks and months, we hope we will continue to engage with more of the philanthropic sector on these recommendations. So there's a link in the chat for a form to submit a question if you want to, or provide feedback. You can always reach out to the Council's Government Affairs team with any questions or suggestions. So right now, I want to turn it over to Steve Seleznow, the President and CEO of the Arizona Community Foundation.
Thank you, David, very much. And thank you to the Council for convening our working group. I just want to say to everybody participating today, I have a non-COVID viral infection that I'm just getting over, so I hope my voice holds up throughout. It's unfortunate that other viruses are not getting much attention these days, but be careful and hopefully I'll get through all of this. As many of you know, this is a conversation our sector has been having for many years. And I'm really thankful to the Council for asking us to come together to create our voice and our narrative and develop our recommendations that our sector could support. And to articulate our point of view and the point of view of our donors with respect to DAFs. I think what's been missing from the conversation is the voice of the donor, and I think all of us who work in community foundations represent that voice, and I think that voice needs to be heard. The first thing our working group did was develop a set of principles, a set of shared beliefs about donor advised funds as a starting point to guide the development of some recommendations. We felt that any work related to reforming or legislating DAFs ought to be driven by some guiding principles and shared beliefs about their role and their value. And together, we felt it was important, given these discussions, that the value, purpose, and societal impact of DAFs be put out there, and to articulate what we believe is best for our existing and prospective donors and our communities based on decades of experience and billions of dollars of community investment. We think that does give us voice in this conversation, and we ought to articulate it. Now you see the 9 principles on the screen, and I just want to highlight a couple of them about the value of DAFs that I think are really important. You know, one of the reasons American philanthropy is so respected around the world is that we've created a system that incentivizes charitable giving, and DAFs are part of that incentive for charitable giving. And that has built a culture of philanthropy in America and in communities large and small, and rural and urban, and across the country. And I know this because the Arizona Community Foundation is statewide, and we have 6 offices across the state in rural communities and in urban communities. And we know how important it is in both communities. And so that's a really important principle driving why DAFs are so present and so important to our community. We also know that DAFs are active, they're efficient, and they're flexible, and they're excellent grant-making tools, enabling donors to adapt nimbly to changing community needs and community conditions. And I think we all saw that in COVID in the last 2 years. I'll just give a quick example. For years and years at my foundation, about 1/3 of our grants would go toward education, 1/3 would go to healthcare. And that was a consistent pattern with our donors year after year after year. This past couple of years with COVID, you look at the percentage of grant making of our donors, they completely adapted. They moved more of their grant making to healthcare than they ever had, to now 45% of our grant making. And that just shows you how flexible and efficient they are and how quickly they enable donors to respond to community needs. This DAFs also enable donors to be more strategic and think long-term about their grant making and think about intergenerational giving, which we think DAFs support and promote. I know we all have donors who want their children and grandchildren involved in their philanthropy and to be able to advise their donor advised funds. And so it also promotes thinking about a long-term view of your community and being there when the community needs you. I often think of DAFs as part of the community chest idea in America, that in every community, there's a community chest that's there to support the community. And when you think about community foundations, we really play that role in our communities. And these community chests that we built, large and small, are there when our community needs them. And they're there with the advice and recommendations and counsel of donors who live in those communities. And lastly, they collectively serve as a perpetual source to support communities rapidly and responsibly in times of crisis. And they go in places where government often doesn't fund or support. We fill in the cracks of society where nonprofits are working, where they're most effective if they have the proper funding to serve really difficult needs in neighborhoods and communities. So we feel these principles reflect the importance and the value and the purpose of donor advised funds that hasn't been well articulated in the conversation. And we felt as a work group to lay these 9 principles out would help do that. I'm going to speak for a minute to the first recommendation, which again, all of these recommendations are built on the principles that we developed. And we developed 5 recommendations, and I'm going to talk to the first 2 of them. And one critique that we've all heard about DAFs is that donors are contributing to their DAF, but not to make grants, or that they are letting their funds sit dormant for no reason. I know that is not my case and my experience in Arizona. And I'm sure it's the case in your communities. I've never had a donor tell me that they're contributing to a donor advised fund just to have it sit in a fund. The donors never get the money back. There's no incentive for them just to leave it and do nothing with it. But we know this has been an issue and I think a misperception that most of these donor advised funds are inactive and sitting there for no reason. And I think we wanted to address this fact and be really clear about how we engage donors on a regular basis. The reality of DAFs is that we're in constant contact with our donors. But no one sees us doing that. No one sits in a donor's home like we do and talk about their charitable goals and what they want to do with their donor advised fund, or see the intimate relationships we have with families of multiple generations working together to craft their charitable goals and what they want to do with their DAFs. We see it every day, and that's why we thought we would articulate our voice, because we know that this is what's happening. Now, a few years ago, national standards for U.S. community foundations began requiring all accredited community foundations to have a fund activity policy. I know most of us do. As I talk to my colleagues, I have one at the Arizona Community Foundation. Every colleague I speak to has either fund activity policies or inactive fund policies. And they may vary from community foundation to community foundation. And so we thought, because of that, we would recommend some standards that would address inactive funds. First, we thought a standard definition of an inactive fund as one in which there has been no distribution advised out of the fund for 3 consecutive years. So we wanted to be really clear about a common definition and a common term for what would define an inactive fund. We thought a standard procedure for classifying a fund as inactive, which may include a number of attempts to reach a specific donor who hasn't been grant making in a given year, and a timetable for reaching that donor and ensuring that donor is active. And we've had cases where the donor has passed, the successor advisor was appointed, the successor advisor, failed to follow up, didn't realize what their responsibility was. We notify them to say, hey, we noticed you haven't made any grants. And that's the typical conversation. And then soon thereafter, grants are being made. There are lots of reasons why a fund may be inactive for a period of time, but this recommendation would standardize that whole process and ensure that there are no existing dormant funds that don't serve the purpose of philanthropy and charitable giving. Now, there are some limited exceptions because we know every donor and every donor advised fund is different. And so if we allow for limited exceptions to classifying a fund as inactive, including a legal or practical impediment to making distributions, that ought to be allowed. I tell the story of a donor that in a rural part of Arizona that wants to build a community swimming pool, and she's willing to put up $500,000 from her donor advised fund, and she's struggling to get the leadership and the elected officials of the communities to match or invest funds in doing the same. She doesn't want to spend out her $500,000 until her town council commits to it. Well, I think that's a pretty legitimate reason. And she has a time frame for that. So at such time she can't get that grant made, then she'll move to other things. But she's trying to do good in her community and is trying to work a strategy for distributing out of her donor advised fund to help her community. We also think of it as a fund is classified as inactive, the community foundation can and should use their variance power to terminate the fund agreement. And essentially, that means that if you cannot get a response from a donor in the time period against the standard definition within 3 years, we take over the fund and we start making grants from it immediately. And we think that's fair and we think that's right, and that ought to be standardized. The second recommendation is, how do we report inactive fund policy? And so we recommended the following: that the Department of Treasury be encouraged to issue a rule adding the percentage of inactive funds to the 990. And we think all of us, can produce that and should produce that. So there's complete transparency about it. It's in the 990, and one can see out of the totality of donor advised funds what percentage are inactive in any given year. And the inactive fund would be defined according to the Community Foundation's inactive fund policy, as described in the previous recommendation. And we would also ask Treasury to include a section to provide any additional narrative about any inactive funds, so community foundations can provide additional context if they so choose, or attach as an addendum to the 990 their inactive funds policy. This is in addition to information already provided by community foundations, which includes total number of DAFs, aggregate value of contributions during the year, aggregate value of grants from DAFs during the year, and aggregate value at the end of the year. We think this better explains what inactive funds are and what they're not, and this provides complete transparency into the inactive funds that we have. So those are the first two recommendations. I do believe that inactive funds at most community foundations like mine are very small. And there may be some funds that already meet this definition, but I believe most community foundations know why a donor hasn't advised a grant out in 3 years. And if you know donors, they have many legitimate reasons for doing so, but this would standardize the whole. So now I'm going to turn it over to Kristi Knous, President of the Community Foundation of Greater Des Moines, to speak to the next set of recommendations. Thank you.
Nice job. Thanks, Steve. So the next recommendation is an aggregate donor advised fund annual distribution. Our working group recommended a minimum payout requirement of 5% of the total assets held in donor advised funds at a community foundation. So this is in aggregate and at an entity level. Based on the data, and as Steve was just saying, we know that most community foundations are at or actually well above this 5% floor. One of the criticisms we wanted to address with this is that because there is no floor, there is a misperception that can exist that funds and donor advised funds are just sitting there and are not actively being used for charitable purposes. This recommendation ensures individual donor advised funds continue to be a flexible option for donors while still creating a floor for the amount distributed annually by a community foundation. So when calculating that 5%, we modeled it after what's already established for private foundations. The distributions would include all grants out of the donor advised funds held and related admin expenses and fees. So, and foundations would be able to carry forward any excess over that 5% for up to 20 quarters or 5 years, if for whatever reason they can't make the 5% floor in a given year. In addition, distributions between donor advised funds within the community foundation would not be counted as the 5% requirement or toward the 5% requirement. So that is the recommendation 3. And the fourth recommendation relates to private foundation distributions to donor advised funds. So we recommend that any grant a private foundation makes to a donor advised fund be granted out within 5 years. Private foundations use donor advised funds at community foundations for a wide variety of reasons, and I'm sure we've all seen that. It could be to aggregate funds from various sources for a particular charitable project, simplify their grant-making activities, or partner with the community foundation or other donor advised funds on grant-making. We know that some private foundations also may choose to terminate by distributing the funds into a donor advised fund, which can simplify that termination process for them. So to facilitate the community foundation's administration of this recommendation, all funds contributed in a calendar year would be aggregated so that the calculations are done on an annual basis. There will be an exception for private foundations that are terminating or plan to terminate within 5 years of the contribution made into the donor advised fund. And if a private foundation wants to make a grant to a donor advised fund but does not include it in its 5% annual requirement, it would not need to be distributed within that 5-year period. So that goes with recommendation number 4. And now I'll turn it over to Susie Nelson, the Executive Director of the Community Foundation for the Ohio Valley, to explain the last 2.
Thank you, Kristi. Recommendation number 5 is an easy one. We know that some within our sector have concerns about how donations of illiquid or complex assets are handled. They think that individuals get a tax deduction for far more than what the charity receives. While this is a complex issue, there should not be one set of rules for DAFs and a different set of rules for other nonprofits. So we propose that any changes impacting how we handle donations of illiquid or complex assets should be applied across the sector. We would support convening the charitable community to collaborate on any changes that might be needed. So that's recommendation number 5. Recommendation number 6 is expanding charitable giving. This is something that has been discussed in the sector for quite a while. This is the last recommendation. Our goal is always to encourage people to give, including using their DAFs. And we want to expand charitable giving and not restrict it. We want everyone to have strong incentives to invest in their communities. So we support change in tax policy that will help further this goal, such as passing a universal charitable deduction or a charitable credit. In addition, distributions from IRAs to donor advised funds should count as qualifying distributions. So with that, I'll turn it over to David, and I think we'll start to answer some audience questions.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Thank you for the folks, the working group, to go through the recommendations. So we've gotten a number of questions. So the first one was, so why do these recommendations only apply to community foundations? And I'm going to see who wanted to take that one.
Well, I'll start. Well, we felt our sector needed to articulate what we believe. We know there are lots of DAF sponsors. There are faith-based DAF sponsors. We know there are national gift funds and gift funds run by the charitable sides of large financial institutions. And at the end of the day, all our donors share a common set of beliefs about giving back to their community, whether they choose to do their DAF through a large entity or a national gift fund, or through a faith-based gift fund, or through a university DAF. Donors have those choices. But we felt, as a community foundation and with a history of more than 100 years, that we ought to articulate our own voice. And because we know very, very deeply how DAFs affect our communities directly, because we're in our community, and that voice that we have ought to be heard in this. And that's why we felt community foundations ought to say what they think.
Thank you, Steve. Let's see. So the next question is, are these recommendations a counter to the ACE Act? And mean, I can try to take that one. So the answer is no. There's a Senate bill that Senator King and Grassley have, and then a House companion was released yesterday. There are leaders within our sector and the council membership who have different views, and that's great. We're a big tent, but the council is opposed to the ACE Act because we just think it's going to decelerate charitable giving because it'll just add complexity and also costs for foundations and donors, making it more difficult for philanthropy to address emerging and long-term challenges. So that's our perspective on it. So another question that we got in was, so what happens next? Is the council asking for legislation to be drafted based on these recommendations? Why don't I try to answer that one, and then we'll turn the next question over to Susie. We will be, we're going to be talking to Congress at some point, but we're not going to be introducing legislation anytime soon. We really want to work with our members, with partners, with other voices in the sector, because we think that, look, we're hopeful these are good ideas. We hope people like these. We hope they might be a basis for a conversation moving forward. But, we don't have all the wisdom in the world, right? We have a lot of smart people on this working group, but we want to get everybody's opinions and to see how we can work together across the sector. Because I think if we get something that the whole sector can support, we're just going to be a lot stronger. So the next question, might turn this over to Susie. So is there a role for national standards with these recommendations? Susie, what do you think?
Absolutely. I'm, for those of you who don't know me, I am chair of the National Standards Board, which is a supporting organization to the Council on Foundations. And we have a meeting next week, which one of our agenda items is to review these as a group. And I think that I've been shouting the whole time we've been meeting about the fund activity policy, and that's required among community foundations that are accredited for national standards. And absolutely, I think that's definitely a role that national standards can play in that. I don't think that things will change immediately. We have a policy in place. We might take a deeper look at that policy. We just went through a 5-year review process. So we will have a few changes that will be coming out. And hopefully we'll be prepared to share that with the field soon.
Great, thanks so much. So let's see, the next question was, and ask Kristi if you wouldn't mind addressing this one. I want to make sure I understand the inactive fund policy recommendation. If a fund is classified as inactive by a community foundation, do they have to terminate it?
Oh,
Kristi?
great question. No, I mean, we have variance power, right? So we have the ability to make some decisions related to potentially what we knew the donor was engaged in, what they were passionate about. We could pull the spend rate over to the community foundation's discretionary fund or unrestricted fund to support the community. I think that there is flexibility there, knowing that community foundations have variance power, but that is one option. If you knew for the long term it was really an inactive fund and sort of an abandoned fund.
Great, thank you. Let's see, the next question. What was the discussion behind recommending a 5% DAF payout? Was there any discussion about what could be gained or lost in overall giving? Do you want to try to take that one, Kristi, or?
For sure. Was there discussion? There was a lot of discussion about all of these things, certainly. But I think, we were just really aligned in knowing that we are doing this work. People are using their funds, and we didn't want to hinder that in any way with the recommendations that we were making. And so, that was some discussion then about doing this, not at the individual DAF level, but at the entity level. We were much more concerned about individuals who would just be steered away from donor advised funds because of the complexity in understanding an individual fund payout, but also, what's going to happen to endowment building for those that care about giving for the long term in their communities or for the organizations they care about. And so I think we really wanted to honor and value endowment building as well in this conversation about it being kind of an aggregate. Any other members of the work group that want to comment on that?
Yeah, I'll comment, and I'll take it in another direction from what Kristi just laid out, which I think is exactly right. You know, as I said earlier, we're in regular interaction with our donors, and donors are people, and they're affected by many things. And when you think about the interplay between a community foundation and a donor, often over time, you know, there are a wide variety of reasons and methods in which they give. Some create DAFs and they make a contribution to their DAF in December and they pay it almost entirely out by November. And then they make another contribution in December and they pay it out. Some treat their DAFs like an endowment. But overall, year after year after year, the total giving of all DAFs exceeds 5% by a significant amount. Triple to quadruple from some of the numbers and some of the research that I've seen. And we felt that setting a floor against the totality of DAFs, understanding we're not talking about a single private foundation or a single DAF. We've got hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of DAFs, that looking at that as the collective of the foundation of those donors, that setting that floor of 5% would at least satisfy some who think these funds are sitting dormant. And yet we know that number far exceeds it, but that's a baseline and we were willing to put it out.
That's great, thank you. Susie, anything you wanted to add?
No, I think they covered it.
Okay, so one other question we had is, if I'm understanding the aggregate DAF annual distribution correctly, if a community foundation has only endowed DAFs and has a 4% distribution policy, so there typically is not a larger grant percentage than that, and a 1.25% administrative fee, then would this be in line with the 5% requirement? Does anybody want to take a shot at that?
That would be my understanding.
Yeah.
Is everybody aligned with that?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, that's the idea. I think that it's similar to how private foundations calculate their payout. Let's see. Okay. We had another question about grants from private foundations to DAFs, especially as private foundations are terminating, and making sure we don't unintentionally disincentivize that option. Who would like to address that question?
And we see quite a bit of that. So we really did want to address that through this to say, if that's the purpose of the distribution coming into the Community Foundation Donor Advised Fund, that's absolutely an exemption and will be allowed through this and would not have to be spent out in those 5 years. We wanted to really continue to incentivize that activity.
And the other piece is that we have at our foundation, we have a few of our donors who also have private foundations. And we found in the course of years, the reasons they have a DAF are completely legitimate. They're not doing it to make their 5% payout. They're doing it, one, to be part of the local community and to give through the community foundation, and to support some of the programs and initiatives of the community foundation. So they ought to have a right to do it, but we also felt that you know, it's really important that if it's being counted against private foundation payout, you know, it also ought to go out to the community, and that's why we set that time frame around community payout for that, and to give that kind of flexibility and to ensure that the community would be receiving those funds.
Thank you. Well, let's see. Another question we got is, does the working group believe that these recommendations should apply to all sponsoring organizations or just community foundations?
Well, we prepared this for our sector. And, you know, this is my editorial. I believe, as I saw in COVID, we created, like many of us did, a COVID relief and recovery fund, and we've received an awful lot of gifts to that fund from donors that we don't know that give through either their faith-based donor advised funds or their commercial donor advised funds or their national gift fund. And they're all members of our community and they cared about the community. And so we think, certainly I think that a donor and a DAF at any one of our organizations is a donor with a DAF who cares about the community and cares about charitable giving. Part of why we did this was to create a conversation within our sector as DAF sponsors, and to collaborate and draw upon the ideas of others who sponsor DAFs to enhance, give us additional ideas and make it a more collaborative approach to this. But again, as we said earlier, we felt as community foundations, we ought to speak, and we're hopeful this will lead to more and more conversations across the sector of DAF sponsors, no matter who you are, no matter where you sponsor, and that we have this open communication and dialogue about DAF, because all of us have an interest in it. And at the end of the day, they're all donors in our communities, whether they put their DAF with us or they put it with another type of DAF sponsor. And so we're hopeful this will continue to encourage discussion across various DAF sponsors. And some of that is already occurring. And I think it's been great for the sector.
I think if I can just add that, look, as community foundation CEOs, the group didn't want to say, look, we want to tell you what to do, but for folks out in other parts of the sector. But there was a hope that these could be ideas where we that they are there's interest in for all sponsoring organizations.
And I think one of the things, David, I would add that is important is that the council has said they are open to receiving that feedback. And these articulate a way to have a discussion about what we think are important, and that the council is open to those ideas from others who think these could be perfected in some way or improved in some way, I think is a really valuable part of this whole process. It's very difficult to have a conversation across this gigantic nation about this. It's hard to have it across all 850 of us. And so we're hopeful, because the council put it out there, that will inspire a different conversation around the value of DAFs and how DAF should be addressing the needs of our community.
Thank you. So we had a number of questions about the potential impact on endowed funds and how endowed funds would be included in the 5%. I'm wondering if one of you could take that question.
David, give me a little more on that. They would, you would then encourage that, if it's a 4% or 5%, certainly that would be counted along with the admin fee. And then you've got the spendables, that would, so I think it's just, encouraging giving at the entity level. And it would all be kind of rounded into one average.
Exactly.
Okay.
So we're trying to make it administratively simple, so there wouldn't be rules for endowed versus non-endowed, right?
Well, right. And the hope is that you keep building endowment. I mean, this is really allowing us to honor endowment building as well as those that want to be more flexible.
Exactly. And that's why I think the carryover, that if you're above 5%, you can carry that over for 5 years. That would be another part of this, just like private foundations have, to allow you to make sure that, for those who want to have those endowed funds, that they would allow to be continued. Anybody else on the team who wanted to add to that?
I just, from a smaller community foundations perspective, that's something that has been weighing on me this whole time we've been meeting, and it's vitally important for us to maintain our endowments, because that's the base of our survival. So it's something that we value greatly. I mean, that's part of our mission, is to build endowments. So just from a smaller community foundations perspective, it's vitally important to us to be able to maintain it.
Thank you. Let's see. So one question also was on the charitable giving recommendations. Does the recommendation mean IRA distributions to DAFs should be qualified charitable distributions? And I think the answer is yes. And we haven't already, we'll clarify that recommendation. We also got a question, what's the best way for foundations to provide feedback on these recommendations? As I mentioned, so there's a form on our webpage if you have any feedback, but also happy to talk with you. Just, Jen Holcomb's our government affairs director, or me. We're happy to talk with you. We really believe these recommendations are a starting point, and we want to hear people's thoughts about it. Let's see. So we have a few more minutes left. Let's see. So another question we got is the council working with other PSOs and partners on these recommendations? And we are really hopeful that that we will get we will continue to have this dialogue. That yeah. So the answer is yes. We are. We've had many conversations with our PSO partners, and look forward to continuing those conversations to find, is there a way that the sector can come together on this? Let's see. So in recommendation 1, there's another question we got. It says that the funds of de minimis value would be exempt from being an inactive fund. Was that defined? Was de minimis defined? And I think we did not define it. We just, we weren't trying to write legislative language here. We're just trying to get these ideas out. So I think we didn't define that as what de minimis meant.
We had discussion around generally $1,000 or less, wasn't it, gang? I think. I don't know that we articulated that in the document, but that was sort of where we had some consensus.
Yes. Yeah, I think that was right. Let's see, here's another question. Did the group consider recommending grandfathering all existing agreements for existing DAFs? This might address endowed DAFs that had a lower payout. And again, I think the idea here was we just didn't want to have, we were trying to keep things simple so that there wasn't, one set of rules for a certain group of funds and a different set of rules so that community foundations would have to be tracking things differently. The goal here was to try to have something that's simple, straightforward, and isn't a burden. So I know we just have a minute or two left. Is there anything else that working group members that you wanted to add to wrap up?
But I did want to put a pitch for those of you that are community foundation CEOs. We are going to host in collaboration with the Council on Foundations and CEOnet, a CEO roundtable coming up on February 15th from 3 to 4 p.m. Eastern time. And so thanks for putting that in the chat. There's a link to registration then through the Council on Foundations. So please come if you are a leader of a community foundation to have further conversation.
Thank you. So I think it'll be a great conversation. So let me just thank everyone for coming today. I know we didn't get to everyone's questions, but if we didn't get to it, please send it in the forum or give us a holler. But thank you to the members of the working group for being on this call, and look forward to having additional conversations. So thank you so much and have a great day.